The day started off as one of hope and excitement for Marcus Carter. He was a hard-working man who had spent months saving up for a car, a reliable vehicle that could take him to his new job and help him support his family. Marcus wasn't looking for anything flashy, just something dependable that would get him from point A to point B. After hours of research, he decided to visit a well-known car dealership downtown, a place that advertised itself as the best in customer service. But as Marcus would soon discover, the reality was far from the polished image they portrayed. Marcus arrived at the dealership early in the morning, dressed in his best clothes, a neatly pressed shirt and slacks. He hoped to make a good impression, as he believed professionalism was important, even when buying a car. The dealership was bustling with activity, and Marcus felt a glimmer of excitement as he stepped inside. Rows of shiny cars gleamed under the fluorescent lights, and sales representatives moved about, chatting with customers. Marcus approached the front desk, where a receptionist greeted him with a polite smile and directed him to one of the sales managers, a man named Mr. Lawson. From the moment Marcus introduced himself, the interaction felt off. Mr. Lawson, a stout man with slicked back hair and a sharp suit, barely looked up from his clipboard as Marcus spoke. He seemed disinterested, his tone clipped and dismissive. Still, Marcus remained polite, explaining what he was looking for, a simple, reliable car within his budget. But instead of helping, Mr. Lawson's lips curled into a condescending smirk. "Are you sure you're in the right place?" Lawson asked, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "These cars might be out of your price range." Marcus felt a sting of humiliation but tried to brush it off. "I've done my research," he said calmly. "I know what I'm looking for and what I can afford." Lawson sighed dramatically, as if Marcus was wasting his time. He led Marcus to a corner of the lot where the older, less desirable cars were parked. The message was clear. Lawson didn't think Marcus belonged there, but Marcus kept his composure, carefully examining the vehicles and asking questions. Each inquiry was met with impatience or outright disdain. As the minutes turned into an hour, the situation escalated. Marcus asked about a specific car's history, wanting to ensure it was in good condition. Lawson rolled his eyes. "Why are you even asking? You're not buying today, are you?" Marcus, feeling his frustration boil over, replied, "I've worked hard to be here, and I deserve to be treated with respect." That was the tipping point. Lawson's face hardened, and he took a step closer, towering over Marcus. "Listen here," he snapped, his voice low and threatening. "We don't need your kind wasting our time." The words hung in the air like a slap. Customers and other staff nearby froze, their conversations halting as they turned to watch the unfolding scene. Marcus stood his ground, his heart pounding. He could feel the weight of their stares, the silent judgment. "I'm just here to buy a car," Marcus said, his voice steady but firm. "And I have every right to be here." But Lawson wasn't having it. With a sudden, aggressive motion, he shoved Marcus toward the door. The force wasn't enough to knock him down, but it was clear that Lawson wanted to humiliate him. And then, as if to punctuate his disdain, Lawson threw a punch, striking Marcus square in the chest. Gasps erupted from the onlookers, but no one moved to intervene. Marcus stumbled back, clutching his chest. His breath hitched, not from pain, but from sheer disbelief. He had never imagined that coming to buy a car, a simple, everyday task, would lead to this moment. Lawson pointed toward the exit, his voice a venomous growl. "Get out. Now." Marcus hesitated for a moment, meeting Lawson's glare. Then, without a word, he turned and walked out, his head held high despite the humiliation. As he stepped into the sunlight, his mind raced. He could feel the anger bubbling within him. But he also knew that how he responded would define the situation. He wasn't going to let this injustice slide, not for himself, and not for anyone else who might face the same treatment. What Marcus did next would not only shock the dealership, but also send ripples far beyond that lot, challenging the very foundations of how people are treated based on assumptions and prejudice. But for now, as he stood on the sidewalk, his fists clenched and his resolve hardening, Marcus knew one thing for certain. This wasn't over. Marcus stood on the sidewalk, his hands shoved deep into his pockets as he tried to steady his breathing. He felt the weight of the moment pressing down on him, the sharp sting of humiliation mingling with a simmering anger. How could someone treat another person like that, especially someone who had done nothing wrong? He replayed the scene in his mind, each word and action feeling sharper than the last. But as the anger churned within him, so did a sense of determination. Marcus knew he couldn't just let this go. Growing up, Marcus had faced his share of challenges. He'd been raised by a single mother who had worked tirelessly to make ends meet, instilling in him the value of hard work and dignity. "No matter how people treat you, always take the high road," she used to say. Those words echoed in his mind now, anchoring him as he tried to figure out his next move. Marcus had worked long shifts at a warehouse, skipped nights out with friends, and saved every dollar he could to afford this car. This wasn't just about a vehicle, it was about what it represented: freedom, progress, a step toward a better future. He glanced back at the dealership, the shiny sign glinting in the sunlight as if mocking him. Customers continued to move in and out, as though nothing had happened. Did anyone inside care about what they'd just witnessed? Would anyone speak up? Marcus shook his head, pushing those thoughts aside. He didn't need anyone else to stand up for him. He could handle this himself. But how? He didn't want to act out of anger and make the situation worse. He needed a plan, something that would hold Lawson accountable and ensure that no one else would have to go through what he had just experienced. Marcus pulled out his phone and opened the camera app. With a quick glance to make sure no one was watching, he took a picture of the dealership and its sign. Evidence, he thought. If this escalates, I'll need proof. As he walked toward the bus stop, Marcus scrolled through his contacts. His finger hovered over a name: Jamal. Jamal was one of Marcus's closest friends, someone he trusted to give sound advice. He hesitated for a moment, not wanting to seem like he was overreacting, but then hit the call button. "Yo, Marcus, what's up?" Jamal's voice came through, cheerful as always. "Hey man," Marcus said, his voice quieter than usual. "I just had the craziest experience at a car dealership." Jamal could sense the tension immediately. What happened? Marcus explained everything, from the moment he walked into the dealership to the humiliating encounter with Lawson. He tried to keep his voice steady, but as he recounted the details, the anger he had been holding back began to seep through. Jamal listened intently, letting Marcus vent without interruption. "That's messed up, bro," Jamal said when Marcus finished. "You can't let them get away with that." "I know," Marcus replied, running a hand over his face. "But what can I do? It's not like anyone's gonna believe me over them. They probably have lawyers and everything." Jamal was quiet for a moment, then said, "You got your phone, right? Did you record anything?" Marcus sighed. "I didn't think to record while it was happening. I was too caught up in the moment." "Doesn't matter," Jamal said. "You've got your story, and you've got witnesses. Someone had to see what went down. And even if they don't back you up, you can still make some noise. Social media, news outlets, people eat this stuff up, especially when it's about injustice." Marcus considered this. He wasn't the type to air his personal business online, but Jamal had a point. The world needed to know what kind of place this dealership was, and how they treated people based on assumptions and prejudice. But it wasn't just about shaming them. It was about making sure this didn't happen to anyone else. "I'll think about it," Marcus said finally. "Thanks, man." "Anytime," Jamal replied. "And if you need backup, you know I'm here." After hanging up, Marcus sat at the bus stop, his mind racing. He opened his phone again and started typing out a post for social media, detailing what had happened. He kept it straightforward, sticking to the facts and avoiding any inflammatory language. As he typed, a part of him hesitated. Once this was out there was no taking it back. But then he thought of Lawson's smug face, the way he had been dismissed and disrespected, and he hit post. Within minutes, the post started gaining traction. Comments began pouring in, many of them supportive. "This is unacceptable," one person wrote. "Name and shame the dealership," another said. Others shared similar stories of discrimination they had faced, creating a growing thread of solidarity. Marcus felt a mix of emotions: gratitude for the support, anger at the system that allowed this to happen, and a renewed sense of purpose. He wasn't alone in this fight, but as the post gained more attention, Marcus knew he couldn't stop there. He needed to take action. The next day, he planned to visit a local advocacy group that specialized in addressing incidents of discrimination. He had heard about them through a co-worker and hoped they could guide him on what to do next. If Lawson thought he could get away with treating people like this, he was about to learn otherwise. As Marcus boarded the bus and headed home, he couldn't help but feel a shift within himself. He was no longer just a victim of an unjust system. He was someone who could spark change. Whatever it took, he was ready to fight back, not just for himself but for everyone who had ever been made to feel less than. Marcus woke up the next morning with a renewed sense of purpose. The anger and humiliation from the day before hadn't faded, but they had turned into something sharper, a resolve to make things right. He opened his phone to check the response to his post, and what he saw made his heart race. Overnight, the story had exploded. There were hundreds of comments, shares, and even a few private messages from local reporters asking if he'd be willing to speak about what happened. One message stood out, a woman named Alana, who introduced herself as a community organizer and advocate for consumer rights. Her message was straightforward. She had seen his post, and she wanted to help. Marcus hesitated for a moment. He didn't know her, and this was already getting bigger than he'd expected. But then he remembered Jamal's words, "Make some noise." He replied, agreeing to meet her at a cafe later that afternoon. The cafe was bustling when Marcus arrived, the hum of conversations and clinking cups filling the air. Alana stood out immediately, a confident woman in her mid-30s, dressed in a sharp blazer with a determined glint in her eyes. She greeted Marcus warmly, shaking his hand with a grip that said she meant business. "Marcus, it's a pleasure to meet you," she said, motioning for him to sit. "First, let me say I'm sorry you had to go through what you did, but I'm glad you're speaking out. Stories like yours are important." "Thank you," Marcus said, feeling a bit overwhelmed. "I wasn't sure anyone would care." "People care more than you think," Alana said firmly. "But the key is to turn that attention into action. That's where I come in." Over the next hour, Alana explained how her organization worked. They helped individuals like Marcus navigate situations involving discrimination and unfair treatment, ensuring their voices were heard by the right people. She suggested filing a formal complaint with the local consumer protection agency and reaching out to a lawyer who specialized in civil rights cases. She also offered to connect Marcus with others who had faced similar experiences, creating a stronger case against the dealership. Marcus listened intently, feeling a mix of hope and apprehension. This was uncharted territory for him. He had always kept his head down, focused on his goals, and avoided making waves. But now he realized staying silent wasn't an option. As they talked, Alana brought up another point. "Your story is gaining traction online, which is great. But if you're open to it, I'd suggest doing a video interview. People connect more when they can see and hear you. It makes the issue feel real." Marcus hesitated. The idea of putting himself out there like that made him uneasy, but he couldn't deny the impact it could have. "I'll think about it," he said finally. After their meeting, Marcus felt a sense of clarity. He had a plan now and people who believed in him. But as he walked home, he couldn't shake the feeling that this was only the beginning. The dealership wasn't going to take this lying down, especially if the story continued to gain attention. He needed to be ready for pushback. Later that evening, Marcus received a call from a number he didn't recognize. He almost ignored it, but something told him to pick up. "Hello," he said cautiously. "Is this Marcus Carter?" A deep voice asked. "Yes, who's this?" "This is Greg Stanton. I'm one of the reporters who saw your post. I'd like to talk to you about what happened at the dealership. I think it's a story people need to hear." Marcus paused, unsure how to respond. He had never spoken to a reporter before. "I don't know," he said. "I'm not sure I'm ready for that." "I understand," Greg said. "But I want you to think about this. Stories like yours can inspire change. If you're willing to share your experience, it could make a real difference." Marcus agreed to meet Greg the next day, still unsure if he was making the right decision. That night, he couldn't sleep. He kept replaying the events at the dealership, thinking about Lawson's sneer and the way the other employees had just stood by, doing nothing. Why had no one intervened? Were they complicit or just scared? The thought made his stomach churn. The next morning, Marcus met Greg at a small park near his neighborhood. Greg was a no-nonsense kind of guy, with a notebook in one hand and a camera slung over his shoulder. He asked Marcus to walk him through the entire incident, taking notes and asking follow-up questions. Marcus appreciated how respectful Greg was, letting him tell his story in his own words. "We're going to air this as part of a segment on consumer discrimination," Greg said. "It'll focus on the broader issue, but your story will be the centerpiece. Are you okay with that?" Marcus nodded, though his nerves were starting to creep in. "Yeah, I think so." As the interview wrapped up, Greg gave Marcus a reassuring pat on the shoulder. "You're doing the right thing. Don't let anyone tell you otherwise." But as Marcus walked home, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was stepping into a storm. He checked his phone and saw that his post had been shared by a local activist group, reaching thousands more people. The comments were a mix of support and skepticism. Some praised him for speaking out, while others questioned his motives or accused him of exaggerating. One comment in particular caught his eye. "Better watch your back. People don't like troublemakers." Marcus felt a chill run down his spine. He had known there would be backlash, but seeing it spelled out was something else entirely. Still, he refused to let fear dictate his actions. He had come this far, and he wasn't going to back down now. That night, as Marcus sat in his small apartment, he thought about everything that had led him to this point. The long hours at work, the sacrifices, the hope of finally getting a car that would make his life a little easier. And then, in an instant, all of that hope had been crushed by one man's prejudice. But now Marcus realized he had the chance to turn that pain into something meaningful. What he didn't know was that the dealership was already scrambling to contain the damage. Behind closed doors, Lawson and his team were meeting, trying to figure out how to spin the story in their favor. They had no intention of admitting fault, and they certainly weren't going to let someone like Marcus tarnish their reputation without a fight.